Section 24 of Music by Ursula Creighton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24, Schumann and Brahms. The six contemporary composers so near each other in age, Berlioz, Chopin, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Liszt, and Wagner, represented to the world a new era in music. Of these six, Robert Schumann, 1810 to 1856, made an ineffaceable impression on his generation in a way quite different from the others. His almost excessively quiet nature, his sense of humor, his poetical feeling, and the nobility of his outlook, all these combined in a sympathetic, dreamy person who was incapable of conflict, such as surrounded the lives of Berlioz and Wagner, and incapable, too, of the commanding position attained by Mendelssohn and Liszt. But his imaginative and sometimes fanciful music, his sincere criticism and warm appreciation of other musicians, earned for him a position of great respect and of warm admiration and affection all over Europe. He composed music from his childhood onwards. He wrote poetry, he read a great deal, he arranged performances with his friends, and when he was sent to study law in Leipzig, he gave by far the greater part of his time to music. He loved Bach's piano works for their depth of feeling and acquired an intimate knowledge of them. He took piano lessons from Wieck, then the best teacher in Leipzig, and when finally his mother allowed him to take up music as a profession, it was to Wieck that he went, and it was in Wieck's house that the great romance of his life began, his love for Wieck's young daughter, Clara. For several years Schumann was an intimate friend of the Wieck family, welcomed as much for his light-hearted gaiety as for his music, for Wieck's household was in some ways severe. Wieck himself was a wonderful teacher, and his daughter Clara became the first woman pianist of the day, owing largely to his teaching and fostering of her talent. He was, however, in some ways a very difficult person. He had quarreled with his first wife, and her children were seldom allowed to see her. By very hard work, he had raised himself from great poverty to an important position in the musical world. But he was embittered by his contempt of musicians whose aims were lower than his own, and by the many difficulties he had to surmount during his daughter's career. In spite of this, his house was a center of music, and for years it was a second home to Schumann. A few months after taking up music seriously, Schumann permanently injured one hand and was therefore unable to become a distinguished pianist, which was the aim he had set before himself. He therefore devoted himself to composing, and in 1833 he started a new musical activity, for he founded with a few friends a paper for musical criticism, the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik. The music that was most generally heard early in the 19th century was certainly not the best. Pianists played mostly brilliant but rather empty pieces by composers now quite disregarded. Light Italian opera was the most popular. Bach was almost unknown to the public, and though Weber, Beethoven, and Schubert had died not long before, no one appeared to pay any attention to their music. It was second-rate music that reigned in public performance and in public taste. The new paper founded by Schumann was to work to guide public taste into the appreciation of better music and new music, and so great was its success under Schumann's editorship that it soon had a large circulation and an important position. It discussed interesting subjects. It criticized openly and sometimes severely music which was meretricious. A famous instance of this was a caustic article on Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots. It produced excellent notices of living musicians, Mendelssohn and Chopin among others. It welcomed newcomers. Some of the most remarkable instances are Schumann's article on Berlioz before he was well known, and his prophetic pronouncement about Brahms, then quite unknown. Many of the articles Schumann himself wrote are still well known as valuable literature on music. Schumann composed at first in a rather desultory manner. At first, too, all his music was for pianoforte, short pieces, very original and with beauties that show an individual genius. Some of his best-known works are collections of short pieces, as Carnaval, a series of vivid pictures of personalities and moods, Kreisleriana, Kinderscenen, Fantasiestücke, and Faschingsschwank. He wrote, however, longer works. His Études symphoniques, an air with variations, has such beauty and feeling that it is still an important work for piano. His Fantaisie is also a long and beautiful work, and he wrote as well piano sonatas. In 1835, Mendelssohn settled in Leipzig, and he and Schumann became great friends. Schumann had a great admiration and really warm affection for this contemporary. Indeed, when Schumann gave affection, he gave it with unchangeable feeling. The great affection of his life was for Clara Wieck, who became his wife in 1840. But the marriage only took place after years of struggle against her father's disapproval. All the bitter side of Wieck's nature came out in those years. He did his utmost to prejudice musical friends in different towns against Schumann and his daughter, and they had at last to appeal to the law to enable them to marry. This made a complete break with Wieck, until in later years he appreciated Schumann's work as a composer and wrote to his daughter, saying that he wished to hear some of her husband's music. The beauty of Schumann's nature and the warmth of his poetical feeling gradually made their way in the world through his music. There was little that was sensational about his fame, but on the rare occasions when he traveled with his wife to Russia, Austria, and Holland, his presence was the occasion for warm outbursts of appreciation. Schumann's happiness was in the quiet domestic life with his wife and children. Here he composed, saw his friends, and made an atmosphere of wonderful happiness. He and his wife were devoted to each other. She felt that much of her life's work was to make his music known and understood, and her famous powers as a pianist she retained throughout her long life. She still seems near to people of the present day, for she only died in 1896, and two well-known English pianists, Leonard Borwick and Fanny Davies, were her pupils. The married life of the Schumanns was full of music, which set a high standard to their contemporaries. It was, however, very short. Schumann, who had always been highly strung, evidently exhausted his nervous strength in his constant flow of composition, and then came terrible times of nervous weakness when he heard continually music and sounds in his head and could get no rest. Repose from work, change in treatment had, however, a beneficial effect, and whenever he was well enough he worked with renewed pleasure. No one foresaw the tragedy that was coming. In 1854 he had a prolonged fit of nervous depression and seemed to be conscious that he was not able to control his actions, for he several times asked his wife to leave him in case he should do her harm. Each time she did so, and returning found him glad to see her again. But at a moment when no one was with him he left the house and made an attempt to drown himself. He spent the last 2 years of his life in an asylum. An increasing pressure on his brain proved incurable, and from it he died. To his friends and contemporaries it seemed an unspeakable tragedy. In those last years he was not allowed to see his wife and children for fear the excitement might retard his possible recovery, and his brightest moments were during the visits of two devoted friends, Joachim the violinist, afterwards well known in England, and Brahms, then a young musician, fully appreciated only by a few musicians. Joachim had been a friend of the Schumanns for years, and many happy hours had been spent making music in their house. Brahms was a new friend, but his devotion to the Schumanns became a part of his life. All that could be done to cheer Schumann by visits he did. He also did all he could to alleviate Clara Schumann's sorrow and loneliness. Her 6 children were too young to be in any sense her companions when Schumann's last illness began, and she had to work hard playing at concerts to make the money necessary for the care of her family and her husband. Friends who loved Schumann did indeed offer help in money. Mendelssohn was dead, but his brother wrote with great sympathy, as did others. Madame Schumann felt that she ought to make her own way, and through those years of pain and difficulty before and after the death of her husband, Brahms was an invaluable friend. It is not only as a composer for the piano that Schumann is known. His piano works were his greatest contribution to music. Besides those already mentioned, the album of pieces for young players, composed for his children, is loved by everybody and contains some of the best children's pieces that exist. His concerto for piano is a beautiful work, very vivid and effective. The list of other well-known piano pieces, such as the Humoresque, Papillon, and Romance, is too long to enumerate. But as well as his pieces for piano, he wrote some lovely songs when he was first married. He also wrote for orchestra. His symphonies are not considered his best work, but his music to Manfred is true orchestral music. He also wrote some chamber music. One piece is a lovely quintet. Also an opera, Genevieve, which was not very successful, though it contains many beauties. He wrote, too, works for voices and for the church, all of which have beauty. His music has a poetical and pictorial quality which makes it typical of what is known as the Romantic school, to which also most of his contemporaries belong. The romantic feeling in music is unlike the classical feeling for form felt by Haydn and carried to such perfection by Mozart and Beethoven. Schumann's music, in the first place, seems to give us pictures of moods and people, and always with the utmost delicacy. To this generation, his music is not always so sympathetic as it was to listeners 50 years ago, but the beauty of feeling in his greater works, like the Fantaisie and Études symphoniques, the perfection of his songs and the charm of much of his other work make him one of the great geniuses of music. Though many of his shorter works may seem on a small, slight scale, their originality and simple beauty show Schumann's clear and lovely nature and his power of expressing true feeling. When speaking of absolute music, people usually mean that music which depends entirely on musical sound. It is not an accompaniment to words. It conveys no ideas, nor does it describe or convey a poetic conception which can be described in words. The simplest form of absolute music is a melody. For example, in the slow movement of Beethoven's Sonata in E, Opus 109, though it might be possible to describe in words the moments of climax or expectation, it is not possible to think of the music as conveying any idea, any concrete picture or thought. It is just pure or absolute music. It creates a state of mind we could not convey in words and has definite beauty. One composer whose gifts lay entirely in writing music like this was Johannes Brahms, 1833 to 1897. His chamber music, some of the most perfect he wrote, sextets, quintets, quartets, trios, and sonatas for strings, piano, and clarinet, are well known and have moments of exquisite beauty. So have a large number of his works for piano, his symphonies and songs, and his well-known German Requiem. All of his music does not now seem to us convincing. Some sounds beautifully finished but lacks warmth of feeling and seems dry in consequence. But his aim was uplifted and his work sincere, and he made a great impression on those who knew him, even on people who did not find his music very moving. Musicians like Joachim the violinist, Schumann, and Liszt recognized his genius and welcomed it warmly, and Brahms early in life attained a commanding position due to his direct personality and the sincerity of what he wrote. Madame Schumann was one of the first players to make his piano works popular, and they took some time to become so. She was also one of the few people who really knew Brahms. His life was solitary and independent and very uneventful. Though so poor when young that he was forced to play nightly at a public place of entertainment, he had good teachers and worked hard at piano playing and composing. When he was 20, he accompanied a Hungarian violinist on tour and met Joachim, who invited the young man to come and see him. Brahms went and was given letters to Schumann and Liszt, which made a great change in his life. Schumann helped to get some of his compositions published. He also wrote an article in his important musical paper welcoming Brahms as a new genius. This recognition by older musicians was the beginning of Brahms' successful career. For some years he made an income by playing in public and teaching. He also directed the court concerts for Prince Lippi Detmold. At last he went to Vienna, which became his home. Except for musical tours, he only went away for holidays, and much of his holidays he spent near Madame Schumann. His invariable habit in the summer was to rise at 4 in the morning and walk in the country, and it was then all his melodies and most beautiful ideas came to him, and he was able to write them down when he returned home during the morning. He always took his meals in restaurants and liked to be joined by his friends, and except for his many friends his life was very solitary. He lived alone, and as soon as he could make enough money by playing and composing, he gave up teaching. He refused many engagements as conductor in order not to tie himself in any way, but be free for his regular life of composing. His good health only failed after Madame Schumann's death. He caught a chill at her funeral and developed an illness from which he died in 1897. He was buried in Vienna near Beethoven and Schubert. Brahms is always regarded as the last great German composer who had the classic aim of an exterior ideal of beauty. Beauty of form and style is perhaps most demanded in long works for concerted instruments, and it is in such works that Brahms excelled. It is by his chamber music that he most enriched the literature of music, and by it he will always be remembered. Some of his short pieces for piano are the most well-known of his work, his waltzes and Hungarian dances. They're tuneful, vivid, attractive music, which show Brahms' power of producing beautiful work in a simple form. End of section 24 of Music by Ursula Creighton, read by Martha Weller, Champaign, Illinois, March 30th, 2024.